The 1900s were an exciting time for industry. Poor economy meant many men had to leave home in search of work and a chance to see the country. The house on Mulberry Street in South Whitley, Indiana, was built in 1890 by the Norfolk Railroad as a boarding house. The upstairs loft slept upwards of 25 workers, with separate rooms for 4 foremen. The caretaker and his wife slept on the main level in a private room.
I started off the day with a massive kettle of coffee. They would dip their tin cups right in. Most mornings we served mash with fresh eggs from the coop out back. Those boys sure could eat. My goodness, were they ever rowdy, especially if they had a little moonshine. At least once a week things would end with 2 or 5 of them brawling on the front lawn. They knew better than to fight inside my house. Edna Hoffman, cook and nurse.
The traveling workers often only stayed a night or two while materials were being loaded and unloaded. However, workers commonly traveled the same routes, and many came to frequent the Mulberry boarding house. The boarding house was known for the occupants drinking. Oftentimes, the town constable would end up dragging groups of them out of the bar down on State Street, then dragging them back to the boarding house to cool off before sending them on their way the next morning. The house got the wrong kind of reputation in the community.
Even through Prohibition, those boys found their way to trouble. Sometimes rowdy got straight out of hand. Several of those boys would do a few days in the jail and then come back grinning and laughing. A few occasions, no one would come back talking at all. Everyone just kept their gaze down and tried to get back on the tracks as soon as they could. Lester Hoffman, caretaker.
I was called in to break up a disturbance at the Norfolk house nearly every week. One time, by the time I got there was nearly 40 men in an armed standoff on that lawn. Nearly every one of them had a weapon in hand. It was tense for certain, but no one was shot that day. Still, it wasn't 24 hours before one of them rail workers turned up floating face down in the Eel River. No telling how often one of those Norfolk boys were at the center of some sort of disturbance. It wasn't the first time one of those railroad boys or someone in the town went missing, though. Constable Everett Eberly.
Starting the spring of 1920, the house served as hospital and quarantine center during the Spanish influenza outbreak. The 2,500-square-foot layout and large upstairs full of cots for beds made it ideal.
It no longer felt like a home to the boys. It felt like a prison. Rooms full of feverish, groaning souls. Nearly 50 souls were lost in that house the first summer of the Spanish flu. Lester Hoffman, caretaker.
After 1923, even boys who had never stayed in the house before felt uncomfortable there. No one could get a good night's sleep in any corner of the house. Grown men would throw their bedrolls on the porch even in early spring and late fall just to avoid going upstairs. Edna Hoffman, cook and nurse.
The house quickly became known as the Soul House, where so many had died. It was said that the fever-tortured souls who lingered seemed to want to relive their glory days of gambling with dice, smoking cigars and drinking whiskey in the loft. Many said they could see ghosts of the past appear in the upstairs windows or smell their cigar smoke at night. After nearly 2 years as an infirmary, the Norfolk boarding house was sold. Purchased by Edwin Price, a South Bend banker, the house became his family getaway, where his wife and daughter spent most of a 3-year span. The Price's daughter Elizabeth was diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 14, and South Whitley's diabetes clinic was boasting modern treatments that had attracted the Price family. Elizabeth, who slept upstairs, would sometimes run down the stairs in the middle of the night to jump in bed with her parents, crying and terrified, claiming someone had jerked her blankets off her bed and thrown them across the room as she slept. Unfortunately, the community was lied to, as Dr. Katz served his patients a number of placebos, many of which were nothing more than tar and molasses mixed with honey or even salted sugar water. After numerous deaths, the cat clinic's practices were made public and an angry public set fire to the clinic one night, while Dr. Cat was mysteriously locked inside.
We lost our daughter to a manipulative con artist. I would estimate he got what was coming to him. Edwin Price, Times-Union News.
The community rarely spoke of the clinic or incident after that night. Mr. and Mrs. Price were devastated at the loss of their daughter, became recluses inside the house, often only being seen collecting eggs and items from the property's massive garden after sundown. Nearly a decade later, Mr. and Mrs. Price seemed to vanish, leaving the house empty and alone with the ghosts of its past. No one in the community had the means nor the desire to buy the house. Eventually, the house would be sold off and used as the Cleveland Township bus master's residence, parking 2 large buses on the side and rear of the property. Eventually, the house would pass between several owners, sometimes being left empty for years at a time before the next buyer. Homeowners often reported hearing the sounds of fighting in the upstairs loft, or even out in the yard. Many guests of the house have reported losing their bed sheets in the night, like Elizabeth Price had. Many have reported the smells of cigars and whiskey in the loft and bedrooms for no apparent reason. The long, colourful history and ghosts of its past make the Norfolk Mulberry boarding house a unique haunt indeed. If you visit the grounds this Halloween, you just might sneak a peek of a railroad worker standing in an upstairs window or Elizabeth Price playing in the backyard. But please be respectful of both the living and non-living residents, and of course, Happy Halloween.